The proceeding is currently in private.
Order, order, and welcome everybody to this meeting of the Work and Pensions Select Committee, taking evidence for our inquiry on safeguarding vulnerable claimants. We're very grateful to the two witnesses who've joined us this morning, and I wonder if each of you can tell us who you are, starting with Rob Behrens.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Rob Behrens. I'm the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman. I have been the Ombudsman since 2017, and I'm in my last month of office.
Well, nice to see you here. And Rebecca Hilsenrath.
Good morning. I'm Rebecca Hilsenrath. I am the Chief Executive Officer at the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman.
Thank you both very much for coming. Can I then put the first question to you? You told us in your written evidence that DWP, and I'm quoting here, did not do all that it could do to recognise the vulnerability of a claimant due to their circumstances and adapt its actions in accordance. I wonder whether you could just tell us a little bit more about what you had in mind with that point, what you've observed here, and what more you think the department ought to be doing.
Thank you. There's some structural issues that I would like to come on to which make it very difficult to call the department to account. But within the context of what we can do, we have a constructive dialogue with the Permanent Secretary over a period of time. That's good. That's about better complaint handling in the department. There is a reasonable approach to investigations. You know, the department defends its corner. It submits evidence. It doesn't hide stuff. It's quite defensive in the way that it does that, but it's entitled to be that. In the cases that we have investigated, we have found maladministration, poor service to a number of individuals in key situations, which makes us concerned that vulnerability is not taken as seriously as it might be.
Tell us a little bit more then about these structural problems that you touched on.
Sure. So the National Ombudsman, the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, is one of the few ombudsmen in the world in which citizens do not have direct access to my office on matters concerning government departments. So if you are a citizen with a complaint about benefits, in most countries you could go directly to the Ombudsman to make a complaint. That's what the Venice Principles, which are our guiding document adopted by the United Nations and the Council of Europe, says is exemplary practice, that you have the right to go to the Ombudsman. In our case, since 1967, there has been an MP filter, which means that citizens, those who wish to complain on non-health issues, have to go via their MP before they can go to the Ombudsman. So in the case of DWP, you go to the department and a senior manager. You then go to ICE, which is the body set up to review complaints. You then go to your MP, and if you're lucky and you've survived all that, you can then come to my office. Now, we know that this has a very substantial impact on the number of complaints we receive from people about DWP. It's not an interpersonal issue, it's a structural issue. We have a very small number of complaints each year about DWP, and we know that the reason for that is that when we tell people that they have to go via their MP, 2,000 people in the recent survey that we looked at, 80% of those people disappear. They don't come back. They don't go to, or if they go to their MP, we don't see those cases. Now, I think in comparison to health, what it does is it cuts off legitimate complaints that we can look at about DWP and the Home Office as well. And the MP filter was introduced in 1967 as a temporary measure and has never been addressed since.
It doesn't apply in the health service?
It doesn't apply in the health service. Right. Actually, and paradoxically, the majority of complaints that I receive are from about the health service, not about public administration more generally. Now, the Select Committee on Public Administration has made clear since Sir Bernard Jenkins was the chair that this is an iniquitous situation which should be resolved, and there are some signs that there is incremental movement towards resolving it in terms of the Victims Bill, which is currently going through Parliament, which removes the MP filter for victims. But it needs legislation generally, which hasn't been forthcoming, although it's been promised, to reform the powers of my office to ensure that people could actually approach us in larger numbers to look at those issues. I hope that's clear.
It is clear, yeah. In terms of the, as you said, fairly small number of complaints you've had from the DWP, you've nevertheless spotted some things that make you think it's all's not well. Just what kind of things are we talking about here?
We submitted in our evidence some examples of the cases that we're looking at. It's difficult to generalise because the numbers are so small. The very significant case we looked at, which we published and laid before Parliament, was this one, the case of Miss Yu, who was transferring her disability benefits to employment support. And as a result of the failure of DWP, she lived for 5 years on half the amount of money she was entitled to in order to survive the serious conditions she was living in terms of poverty, in terms of her mental health, in terms of her passport payments. And when we investigated this, we found that there were 118,000 other people in the same situation as her, but we could not get the department to agree that this was a structural issue which should be addressed by dealing with those issues and compensating the people. Now that was an admission of maladministration, but a statement by the department that if people wanted to complain to them, they would have to do so on an individual basis, despite the evidence of systematic maladministration. And that is very concerning, because the woman suffered severely as a result of the admitted failure of the department. But in our view, the response of the department was inadequate to deal with that.
Thank you very much. Nigel Mills.
Rob, just some background. Where would you rank DWP in the service they provide? Are they better or worse than other government departments that you look at?
So it's a good question, which I can't answer directly. But what I would like to say is that for the last 5 years, we have taken the view that all departments that we have oversight of could benefit from investing in complaints handling in their own departments through what we call the Complaints Standards Framework, which is a co-produced best practice guide for departments to adopt and to benchmark themselves against what they're currently doing. And this has been widely adopted not only in the health service but in public administration in general. And my conversations with the permanent secretary and the road shows which Rebecca might tell you about, in which we go out and we have a look on the ground at what things are doing, shows there is buy-in by DWP into this idea that they need to improve the way in which they handle complaints. And we've had good dialogue about that. And our view is that all departments, like the Home Office, DWP and so on, have to invest in the professional development of complaints handlers in order to do a better job on the front line, so that we receive only the more significant cases and that people can get justice on the front line more quickly than waiting to come to us. Now, in that sense, I would say the department has responded constructively, but there are large areas which we cannot make a judgment about because we don't have access to the practice in the department.
If I can add to that, I think the place to start from, and I'm completely aware that the committee knows this, is that we're talking about people who are in extremely vulnerable circumstances. And obviously many of the government departments we work with deal with a range of people for a range of reasons. But in looking at benefits applicants, we're talking about people who are all actually in vulnerable situations and whose situation is likely to change and become more vulnerable as a result of working through these processes. So you're looking at a large government department with practice across the country where by its very nature it's a system. It's not as flexible as it could be. And you're working with individuals in challenging places who don't necessarily fit in the system, and where there's a need to be proactive in developing practice, being innovative, working with partners to ensure that you reach people who actually probably aren't going to come up voluntarily, proactively to your front door to tell you about their vulnerability. We have talked to people in the DWP who've worried that people haven't identified vulnerability to them, and it's really about understanding it's the other way around. We know that there is very good practice out there, and we've visited areas where there's good and innovative partnership between the DWP and third sector collaboration. But we also know it's very inconsistent, and we've heard stories about people who say, well, it depends which caseworker you get, and if you complain, it depends what senior manager you talk to. So there's something about recognising the scale of the operation and the need to be flexible, but the need to be consistent in terms of what good practice looks like, and the need to have appropriate protocols there for particular vulnerabilities. One example of people that we spoke to who were very concerned about people being discharged from prison and not being able to access benefits quickly enough to avoid going back, reoffending, going back into prison, which is actually to nobody's benefit. So what we're seeing is a lack of proactive, innovative thinking to ensure that you're covering the range of challenging circumstances and ensuring that that is something that the department is taking on, and through its outsourced agencies, because it's a positive duty. Because they're working with claimants who need that positive, proactive help.
And do you think any other departments are better at that, or is this a general problem across government services?
Well, as I say, I think the issue with the DWP is the nature of the circumstances that the claimant is working with, and that has to be taken into account in thinking about what they're doing. So an example of this is that many of the people who are working with DWP, who are applying for benefits, can't really do so without support, may be suffering from mental health problems, may have a long-term disability. There is support available from Citizens Advice, But this is quite limited. I believe it's digital or over the phone, and it stops at the point that you make the application. So it isn't there throughout the appeals process, which comes back to the point that Rob was making in terms of the lack of oversight, the lack of effective challenge, the difficult pathways to appeals, and that means that there's an inbuilt inability for DWP to learn about what goes wrong. There are too many barriers to people effectively being able to tell them what's going wrong.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Desmond-Swain.
Why didn't DWP become one of the trailblazers for the new process?
That's a very good question, sir, and you'll have to ask DWP that. I mean, it was disappointing that they didn't, but they have not been negative in their response to the general principles of the complaint standards. And what's interesting is that ICE was a member of our working group, which moved towards setting up the Trailblazers. But it would have been a really good signal if they had become a trailblazer.
Is there going to be an expectation that all departments are going to have to implement the general standard for complaints, the central standard?
Yeah, the Ombudsman has no executive power, can't force anybody to do anything. It relies on its moral authority. I've been delighted with the way in which public administration has responded to this, because it's so important to be able to use complaints as a way of improving good practice. So what we've co-produced it so that it's not us telling people what to do, it's us talking to people on the front line to agree what constitutes good practice. We've set out what the framework is. We've provided good practice guides. We now do training for complaints handlers, and we've facilitated CPD points for over 500 people to demonstrate their increase in skills. And what we will do and are doing is that if we see in our investigations that departments have departed from the complaint standards, we will use that in our investigations and our decisions to point out where that has failed. And I think that's a good way of proceeding, rather than being dictatorial about it.
So how could DWP make it easier to complain?
Well, first of all, Parliament needs to, in my opinion, to change the MP filter so people have an opportunity to complain directly to me.
What's the rationale for introducing that filter in the first place?
Well, I've read the papers around the creation of the office, which I have the privilege to lead, in the 1960s. The Justice Report of 1961, which was the founding document for the Ombudsman, was a very deferential document in terms of its respect, or I would regard its over-respect for Parliament. It talked about the need not to interfere in any way with Parliament's role. It talked about the needs of the little man in society who could benefit from an ombudsman. But it saw the ombudsman as a way of assisting Parliament, MPs, in doing their jobs. But it said it would review that after 5 years. Now, the volumes of cases in the early years were very small. And it took until 20 years ago for people to really understand what the impact of the MP filter would be. And now there is that understanding, and there is a common consent that it needs to be changed without undermining the constitutional role that you perform, which is absolutely vital. So I'm clear that people can still use their MP to come to me if they want to, but they should have the opportunity to bring their case in line with the Venice principles. And that would be a better way of bringing greater scrutiny to the department. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I'll come on to what DWP could do because you asked that. The second thing, this is critical. Most of my counterparts in Europe, from a study which I conducted during COVID in 2020 and 21, so 58 national ombudsman schemes participated in this. And most of them have the power of own initiative to look at issues which are important but which are not complained about. And what we find, and this is true of ombudsmen across Europe and the world, is that it's the people who don't complain who are the most in need. The more vulnerable you are, the less likely you are to complain. Now, most of my colleagues, in line with the Venice principles, have the power of own initiative carefully to investigate issues that they believe are of strategic importance, which haven't been complained about. My office needs that power in order to be effective to protect vulnerable people. So I think though the MP filter and the own initiative investigations are critical to the greater effectiveness of the Ombudsman service. As far as DWP is concerned, there's a very important article by Robert Thomas, Professor of Public Law at Manchester University, reviewing how DWP looks at complaints. What I get from that is that there are, of course, good people doing difficult things, as Rebecca said. We met some brilliant people on our roadshows, working for DWP, doing outreach work, trying to help people through going out from their department, not just waiting for people to come to them. But what is of concern to Robert Thomas and to me is the absence of transparency in what DWP does in terms of their reviews, in terms of their thinking about complaints handling. The number of complaints they receive is published, but the types of complaints they receive are not published, so we don't know a lot about that. There needs to be much greater transparency and ownership of the need to protect vulnerable people. Now, we'll come on to this, I'm cautious about having a duty as far as this is concerned. But transparency is absolutely critical to enable people to be able to understand better what they're doing and to have a conversation.
Can I add to that? First of all, Rob's absolutely right about the lack of publication and transparency about data on the nature of complaints. But I don't actually think the DWP share it inwardly or keep it themselves. We've spoken to people in the DWP who don't know what the data is on previous complaints, so they're unable to do anything about what's happened in the past. But to your point about what the DWP can do to make it easier to complain, and completely obviously endorse everything that Rob has said on a structural basis, but just to come back to what I said before, these are people in extremely vulnerable circumstances, which I know I've said a lot, but just to kind of emphasise that. So it's not like what perhaps some of us might do if we're complaining about a car parking fine or something. I think the first thing is about the need to understand their very limited bandwidth to complain, and the need to make it easier for them. At PHSO, we have recently set up a public and user engagement panel, which is helping us through working with people who complain to us and other members of the public to understand how our processes need to improve in order to be user-friendly to the people that we work with. And I've encouraged the DWP to do that, to work with people with lived experience, which they do in some places, to understand better the support that people need to make complaints, because they do need support. They will need more support than what they're getting from citizens' advice, which, as I say, stops at the point that they've made the application and doesn't continue through to actually making a complaint. There are lots of third society partners out there. who would be able to provide that sort of support if DWP were able to fund them to do that. And something about looking at the way that the complaint system actually works. My understanding is there's a lot of repetition involved. So people who've gone through what's A, difficult, B, lengthy, and C, probably quite challenging in terms of telling people about your personal circumstances, which may involve trauma and may involve a lot of difficult stuff, but having then to do it all over again because it's not kept in a way that is accessible to the person who's handling the complaint. We know, and I know the committee will be aware, that if people who go through the complaint process aren't happy and go to a tribunal, the chances of actually overturning the original decision are very, very high. So we know that there is something about the original decision-making process that is susceptible to challenge. And we want to make an offer from us to help DWP to work with them outside the tribunal process. The tribunal process is quite intimidating to people. And the problem about the tribunal process is that the decisions are made on a case-by-case basis. So then tribunals are not in a place to be able to look systemically at what's going on. We have been talking to DWP, but also to HMCTS and to the MOJ about the possibility of looking at signposting to see where it's possible, if complaints can come to us, that would enable us to take a more strategic and systemic look at what is going on, to hopefully have more of a strategic impact, to save some people going through the formality of a tribunal process. But then to be able to understand through that work the critical underpinning to what a statutory duty might look like. Because coming back to what Rob was saying about needing to understand better what the value added of a statutory duty would be, to my mind it's really about understanding what compliance with that duty would look like, and that's got to be about understanding what's actually not working at the moment.
Thank you very much. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you. And good morning, both of you. Lovely to see you both. I'm just going to start some questions on about the systemic issues or the systemic approach to safeguarding across DWP. And I think you already, in the evidence you've just provided, indicated that it's not great, but there seems to be issues internally that staff themselves don't really know the process as well. And I just wondered if you wanted to comment, particularly thinking about the deaths of claimants and that particular process. We had the Permanent Secretary here last month, and questions relating to the deaths that the serious case panel will be speaking to others in relation to that later on this morning, revealed that the serious case panel had only looked at 60 out of the 89 deaths and serious harms. And when we needed to get, the Permanent Secretary needed to write back to us to give us more information about that. But what a Freedom of Information request has since revealed is that of the 29 IPR referrals that the serious case panel didn't look at, there were 18 deaths, including 4 suicides. And that contrary to what was understood after the NAO investigation of the suicides of claimants, these weren't referred automatically to the serious case panel. So we've been looking at this in terms of what was the existing arrangements around safeguarding. My personal view is that they are very much devolved down to the ground level and to individuals rather than it having a systemic approach. So I particularly thinking about the ultimate failure. We have claimants that are dying. We're not going to be able to stop every death, but we really don't know the scale of these deaths. What do you think in terms of the structural reporting arrangements? Others are going to be talking about transparency in a minute. How's it doing, do you think? Who wants to kick off, Rebecca or
I think in a sense we've probably covered a lot of this ground by saying that because there is limited oversight, because the barriers to complaints mean that we don't see enough complaints, because data isn't published, because of the sort of governance around ICE, which is not actually independent from the DWP, because there's very little understanding and transparency about what the serious cases panel provide and what the IC independent panel review says either. It's actually quite difficult to know beyond our experience. So what we have seen, and just to come back, Chair, to your question at the beginning about the cases that we put in the submission and the findings that we've made, the reason why we chose those cases is partly because they gave evidence across the breadth of different benefits, indicating it's not just restricted to one space. It involved agencies, external agencies as well, different agencies that had been involved in cases, and the people involved were all suffering in particularly vulnerable circumstances, and the lack of understanding of the DWP about where they were and the lack of proactivity in terms of safeguarding was quite striking. And I'll cite one, which was a woman who had been suffering from poor health and had a stroke, and therefore her health deteriorated obviously considerably and her needs escalated, and she was transferring from DLA to PIP and had to wait twice as long as she should have for a home visit for an assessment. Which obviously caused significant hardship because she was living off too little money for her needs in the meantime. Our concern when we investigated this case is that the DWP had said that she could have actually halved that waiting time if she had not had a home visit, if she had come into the offices, which indicated a profound lack of understanding of the purpose of the visit, but also a profound lack of understanding of her circumstances. And I think had we looked at the case and they'd just said, oh, well, this is terrible, mea culpa, we got this one wrong, we'd have had less concern. When you talk about safeguarding, it's that lack of understanding, it's that lack of looking at the circumstances of a complainant, and whether it's training or whether it's a lack of policy. We've actually been told that they get very good training, and that I suspect this is very much a question of inconsistency across the piece. But there seems to be a lack of proactive questioning of, oh, well, we've seen this issue, so that means we might want to ask about this, and we might want to assume that there's a need for more support. That's not happening. And I also mentioned earlier, we've been told about a lack of protocol, a lack of framework for people who've been discharged from prison. And that just seems to me to be an obvious circumstance where there would be need for particular care, particular safeguarding, a particular process, which to my understanding is absent. So it's that lack of structured and curiosity and professional understanding that we have seen in the cases that we've looked at.
Could I just come in? Because I think there's an issue of accountability here. With due respect to all my colleagues who are working very hard in departments, when we published this case, as I said, we found that there were 118,000 people in the same position which the department accepted had been created because there had been maladministration, a service failure. But they would not comply with our view that these people should be compensated. And what would normally happen historically is that if there is non-compliance, that would come to the Select Committee on Public Administration to question the department about why they chose not to comply and to have a public debate about that. In this case, for reasons that I'm prepared to accept, that hasn't happened in PACAC. there has been a kind of exchange between your committee and the department about it, but there's been no public hearing about this issue in a way which means that if people don't comply with our recommendations about vulnerable people, there could be a sense that they don't need to defend themselves publicly as far as that's concerned. So I think, and I may be wrong, but I think it's very important for this committee and for the Public Administration Select Committee to continue the practice of looking at non-compliance to make sure that the department is aware that Parliament is supporting its Ombudsman in this respect.
Thank you. A very important point indeed. Very, very briefly, I'm conscious other colleagues want to get in as well then, and I don't think it's on the set of questions. So we've said that it's a bit of a hodgepodge, lack of transparency. What would a good regulatory system in the safeguarding sense look like from your point of view, so that we don't get the complaints, so you don't have your workload increase? What would it look like?
I am not an expert on this, and I could give you my experience of the regulatory oversight in other sectors which works and doesn't work. So I think it's very important, and I've read the previous evidence that people have given, not to talk about vulnerable people, but to talk about situations in which people are vulnerable. And I think those are different things. And there's a danger of stereotyping people and calling them vulnerable and creating special measures. For me, the key issue is the fundamental approach to how you deal with people in general in what are already very difficult situations. And I think we've said that there's a lot of work that can be done as far as that is concerned. But my experience of the health service, it makes me very sceptical about what a specific duty can do in the situation which you're looking at. So there is a duty of candour on the health service to require people to tell the truth about what has happened when things have gone wrong. That does not work, despite the fact that it's been adopted. It simply has no traction in the health service, and parents of families are time and again not told the truth about what has happened to their children in care. So merely having the duty is not a guarantee that it's going to be abided by, because there's a cultural issue which has to be addressed, which is related to the learning, the accountability in the department and the transparency associated with it.
Yeah. I would just add to that.
Briefly, if you would.
Very briefly.
Yeah.
I do think it's about flexibility. I do think it's about going out into the community. I do think it's working with lived experience and understanding that trust is a key element here. And that has to be about working in collaboration with the third sector and with people who've actually been there. But I just would add really quickly one other thing. I do think it's important, and I don't come from a place of expertise, not to worry about money in this space, because I think there's a false economy. Yeah. What happens at the moment, which sends people back into vulnerable places, back into prison, instead of actually the ability to turn them around into contributing members of society, which actually is going to be a lot better outcome.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you. Siobhan Bailey has a brief point.
Briefly, taking you back, Rob, I was quite struck by your points on the own initiative investigations that other countries do have. If you feel able to tell us some of the kind of areas that you would initiate that type of investigation that you've spotted already, I think that would be very interesting.
I mean, it's all, perhaps I could leave this with the committee because it's all in here. And one of the most interesting things was that those countries that had an ombudsman with own initiative powers were able to look very quickly at some of the issues arising out of COVID, which we have had to wait until we've had complaints about. What the thing that most struck me about own initiative is that when I looked at the Windrush cases, a big scandal, the failure of a huge central government department, where we had very little numbers of complaints, although we did find maladministration, of course, in those cases. What complainants told us was that they were intimidated by the idea that they would go to their MPs on this very sensitive issue, and they didn't feel comfortable about doing it. So it didn't come through to us. And we could have looked at that issue much more quickly than has been done if we had seriously addressed concerns of people that we might be interfering in the legitimate space that government adopts. So I've talked to ministers about this, and they have said, if you have own initiative powers, that's okay, providing you use it responsibly. You don't just pick up something from a newspaper and run with it. You make sure that somebody else isn't dealing with it. But in lots of cases around, for example, disability benefit, we could have run with that. It's still ongoing since we published the report in 2022. We could have returned to it. But without the cases, you can't do that. Now, could I just give you one other example, which is from health, if I may do that? We know that in mental health hospitals, young people sometimes die very quickly when they're admitted into hospital. I had a case where that had happened, and I investigated it, and I found 19 examples of maladministration in the case that was brought to me, where the young man subsequently took his life. His care plan was doctored after he died, and so on. It was disgraceful. I subsequently found out that 25 other people had died in the same way, in the same hospital, but I could not investigate those cases because the families had not complained about them.
Thank you very much. I should have called over.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. In your opinion, is the DWP adequately transparent about its policies around safeguarding and obviously the failures, safeguarding failures?
Well, I think we've already spoken to this. I think it's actually quite difficult for us to understand what the range of policies are and what the oversight looks like. And it's been really interesting understanding their submission to this committee, because that's provided us with more information than we had previously. And I talked, by way of an example, we talked to a DWP office where we were told that there was a team in place who were checking, I know this is slightly off subject, but it's relevant, a team in place who were checking the applications for benefits, essentially checking them for fraud. And during the time that those checks were carried out, which was, I think, a matter of perhaps up to 2 or 3 months, the process was suspended so that the payments weren't made until that was completed. And the point that the team made to us was that not only had this actually not resulted in any finding of fraud, but also they actually hadn't seen the guidance to which this other team were working, so that the team who were actually looking at processing the complaints didn't have the information that the guidance for what the fraud checks would look like. So they don't themselves have the information in order to be able to process those complaints in an appropriate way. So there's a sort of lack of transparency that's inherent to the way the DWP operates. We don't know what these policies are, and I'm not convinced. We don't have the evidence that they're sufficiently widespread across the piece.
That's fine. Would you like to add anything, Dal?
No, it's, my position, and I've been on these road shows. We were in an impoverished part of England this week to talk to people who wouldn't normally come to us. And we met good people working in outreach work from DWP, doing exactly what they should be doing. And so what I don't want to do is to come here and say, fundamentally this is wrong. There are good people and good policies operating in DWP. I want to make that clear. But I think Rebecca is absolutely right that transparency is not sufficiently built into the culture of the organisation so that you could legitimately say it is a learning organisation, because I'm not sure that it is.
Thank you. So in relation to how they work effectively with yourselves at the PHSO, when it comes to investigations, when it comes to engaging with you, are they willing and open and being transparent in terms of any of the changes that you recommend in terms of how they would implement that?
We have a very good relationship with DWP, and obviously we work with them across many levels. And Rob can speak to his conversations, and mine for that matter, with the Permanent Secretary, which are really helpful and constructive. We do find that sometimes they can be quite fixed in their views of what should or shouldn't happen. And Rob has already spoken about the case of Ms. Yu, where we believe that there are 118,000 people who should at the very least have been made aware that they have been underpaid in terms of the benefit they were provided. And our conversations with the DWP have showed that they kind of, I think they see that as kind of quite a backward-looking, meaning it's focused on the past instead of the future. And we believe that that's essentially not fair in terms of this having been an outcome of maladministration on their part. But that doesn't mean to say that we don't have very good conversations with them across the piece. We also work with ICE, who are a key part of our conversations with government complaints handlers across the piece. They're enthusiastic, they're engaged. We find actually that the quality of their investigations is really good, and they're often incredibly helpful in terms of really getting to the nitty-gritty of what happened as opposed to what should have happened. Where we struggle sometimes with ICE is that their conclusions in terms of what remedy might be appropriate tend to be quite sort of in the same sort of space, often like £200, regardless of what's necessarily gone on, and we're not sure that they are as clear as we would like to be about the nature of the injustice and what remedy needs to look like. Although ICE actually have also been quite clear to us that there are instances of DWP not following their own protocols and processes, which has been helpful to us. So we have those really helpful conversations, but it's inconsistent. And I suppose the key thing is about transparency and wanting to see more evidence of there being a learning culture embedded.
Thank you. Just can you outline for us what would adequate transparency look like? What are you asking for?
Well, you have had evidence about the 6-point plans, about the internal process reviews, help to claim, serious cases panel. We don't really know enough about how those excellent initiatives operate, because they're not really put into the public domain. And I think it's legitimate for there to be an account of that, not in order to criticise it, but to understand and to demythologise the process.
More about the processes to be in the public domain.
Yes.
It's not sort of data you're looking for, it's process descriptions.
Yes.
Yeah. It is also data. I mean, so the number of, and this comes back to the article that Rob mentioned, written by Professor Robert Thomas, the number of complaints that have been made to DWP have gone down dramatically. But the complaints that have been made, on the data is not kept. It's not possible for DWP or anybody else to say, oh, well, there have been this number of complaints made about this part of the DWP or this aspect of their process. Without that transparency, there can't really be true understanding. And I do kind of, would like to apologise for that. A lot of what we said is anecdotal, and we acknowledge inconsistency, but that is because of a lack of hard data for us to understand what's really going on.
Okay, thank you.
Could I just make one other structural point about this? You talk in your previous sessions about whether or not there should be a new body set up to oversee safeguarding. Mm-hmm. And I am very nervous about the tendency of government to continually create new regulatory bodies without integrating or rationalising the regulatory oversight in a way that enables us to be joined up and to operate effectively together. And so I would be very nervous about the creation of another body when the Ombudsman, for example, doesn't have the powers which she or he needs in order to effectively bring the department to account.
We're coming to that very point in just a moment. Sylvain Saxby.
Thank you and good morning. And some of my question has been covered in some detail, but just to really clarify, in your views, would a statutory duty to safeguard vulnerable claimants help to create a better culture of safeguarding and a greater level of accountability in DWP? And would a statutory duty achieve anything above and beyond improving safeguarding processes?
Well, I think I've been clear that I'm a sceptic as far as that's concerned. I think there are examples of where, with good intention, statutory duty has been created, but it hasn't necessarily worked. And so it's not a quick fix. It's very important to balance the legal aspects of what is done with the culture of the organisation, and they're mutually dependent. And so I think Rebecca could say what would need to be done, but I'm full of examples of where it hasn't worked, which overcomplicates the environment and doesn't lead to a better safeguarding process.
Are there any examples of it working elsewhere in government that you're aware of?
I'll come to that in 1 second, but just following up from what Rob said, so I agree that there's a need to not overcomplicate. But I think I'd like to come back to the point that the Chair's just made about the lack of transparency. We don't feel that we know enough about what's going on to want to advocate for a statutory duty. If we were able to signpost more complaints to us, to work with the DWP, with HMCTS to look at what strategic investigations might yield, we might then be able to come back to you and say, well, we've actually carried out a few quite significant strategic investigations, and we think this piece, and this piece aren't working, and we need that and that. By all means have a statutory duty to implement that, to underpin it. But at the moment, it would feel quite a high-level thing that I don't know what, in a sense, whether it would just layer more bureaucracy on top of what's going on at the moment. The obvious example of a public duty along the lines of what you say is the public sector equality duty, which I think has led to an increased awareness, and it also involves the need for public bodies to set themselves clear objectives and to carry out impact assessments. That's also led in many places to sort of over-bureaucratisation of the issue and excessive amounts of work. So I just think it's really about thinking about what you're trying to achieve and how you implement it.
Thank you, and I think some of the views have already been made clear on my second question around an new independent body to oversee DWP safeguarding practices. Would it be beneficial to improving standards and accountability? Is there anything further either of you would like to add?
I would repeat that it overcomplicates an already overcomplicated arena, and what government should be doing is using what it has in the most rational way that it can be. And my office is desperately in need of the modernisation of its powers to make it even more effective.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving us some very helpful, interesting answers. Can I ask you about a couple of other things? Can you tell us when you expect to publish the findings of your investigation to DWP's handling of the increased state pension age for women?
Sure. Rebecca has personal responsibility for this, so she's in the best position to respond.
So thank you for asking the question, because this is a case that's obviously hugely important to us. You'll be aware that we shared provisional views on this with the claimants and with their MPs on the 21st of November. We asked them to come back to us by January with any comments or views they had on those, and we are currently working through those comments. We are committed to publishing a final decision as soon as we can, but we're not able to give you a specific date at this point.
Are you able to give us a rough date?
No, sorry.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right. Well,
We do regard it as very important to get this out as quickly as possible, but it has to be done rigorously and in respect to the very serious issues that are involved in this case.
will it be before the summer?
Well, I'm going in a month, so I can only speak for the office for the next month.
I can assure you that it is the most important and the most serious case we have. It is taking up a considerable amount of our resource, and as Rob said, it's really important that we get it right. And I'm actually more interested in getting it right in a sense than rushing it out. But that said, we will publish it as soon as we possibly can.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing that. Secondly, you found that the DWP fell short in telling people with large guaranteed minimum pensions about the impact of the new state pension on them. How would somebody show entitlement to compensation over that failing?
If I could answer that one as well, and thank you for that. We have obviously found failings by the DWP in various aspects of communication in relation to pension rights. Where a public sector body has been responsible for poor communication, which amounts to maladministration, we would expect it to compensate affected individuals for both financial and non-financial loss. And in terms of non-financial loss, I'm talking about stress, shock, distress, frustration, which I'm sure the committee will be aware. In relation to financial loss, actually in relation to both kinds of loss, we would also expect complainants to be able to provide evidence to that body in relation to the impact on them. And in relation to financial loss, that is not straightforward, and it tends to be about evidencing what they would have done had they been provided with different information at a different time. Often that's something that can be judged based on what happens when they are provided with the correct information. In relation to the guaranteed minimum pension, if, for example, there were complainants whose behaviour changed once they were provided with different information, where they perhaps started to put a lot more effort into aggressive savings, then it would be possible for the kind of the implication to be that behaviour would have been different earlier. But quite often in those sorts of cases, we don't see there is a change of behaviour, and we don't see circumstances suggesting that in fact the miscommunication had any impact on their finances. It's an evidence-based investigation and process, and it will be determined on a case-by-case basis.
What do you think DWP should be doing to establish potential eligibility?
Well, that's what I think they should be looking at. I think that it is something that does need to be done person by person, case by case, and it's about looking at all the circumstances of the individuals, looking very seriously at how they were impacted in a non-financial way. And we do know that these issues of poor communication do cause very real stress, very real impact on people and on their families. But it also means looking into their circumstances to be able to satisfy themselves that in fact the original poor communication had an impact on how that person conducted their financial affairs. That's going to be different on a case by case.
And in this particular case, do you think the department has such an arrangement?
I'm afraid I'm not aware, Chair.
Okay, fine. Well, thank you both very much indeed. You've given us a very helpful set of evidence. We thank you, Mr. Behrens, for your work in this office ever since 2017. Wish you well for the future. Has your successor been announced?
Very good question. The answer to that is no.
Right. Well, we'll look forward to finding out who it is. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh yes, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.